Hi everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about Philip K. Dick's Progeny, a short story that was published in 1954. Um, and the main thing that I would say made it one of his darkest stories, and I would say arguably in some ways it's probably one of the darkest stories I've ever read, period, um, is that it shows how the educational system in the future becomes more ideological than academic. And for example, the story's about a father who has given his son, like as a baby, over to the robots to raise him. And Dr. Bish is one of these very creepy robots who trains him to be this very unemotional and supposedly good member of society, upstanding citizen of society, because robots in this world are seen as the ideal candidates, the ideal authorities to be able to raise children, which is, of course, absurd when we look at it from an outsider's perspective, when we're not sort of swept up in this kind of technocracy. We already can see what's coming. And sure enough, when the father visits the son 9 years later, his son is, I would say, at the least comes across as cold, maybe even insensitive, has all these little private little quips that he has, and doesn't seem to really connect with him at all. And there's a very telling moment at the end of the story where his son goes back to Dr. Bish, who's been training him, and his son's only 9 years old, but he's like this little, almost like this little jaded adult, but in a 9-year-old's body. And he says to Dr. Bish, and he kind of scoffs and chuckles, my father smelled like the lab animals here that we use in our experiments. And that is, of course, a very creepy and telling detail that indicates where they stand on basically humanistic issues, societal issues, wanting to reduce people to cattle, which is something that I've brought up in many of his other stories, and it continues to be a recurrent theme that you see all the time. And it creates that similar feeling of revulsion and gloom that you get when you watch The Exorcist, when you see Linda Blair go from this kind of innocent child that you don't want her to become jaded or hurt or negatively affected by the world in any way, and then you see her turn into this monster by the forces that she doesn't really have much control over. And that's one of the reasons why I would argue it's actually his darkest story. And I think also, and this is where I think it becomes debatable. It's subjective, but to me, it reminded me of what atheism would look like if it became a religion. And of course, this is more of a feeling and impression because there is no actual reference in the story to atheism. They don't say, well, I don't believe in a God, or I do. But when we think about the sort of ideological stereotype of an atheist, of somebody who, for example, is very uber rational, unable to accept perhaps new concepts, new ideas, has to be attached to this sort of paradigm of realism, but not wanting to kind of step outside the box. That's basically what this world is. So in that way, it's like it really is about attacking the human spirit, human potential, as a way to try to make it so that people will follow orders blindly. Because when you attack the human spirit, you also take away emotion, and emotion is often a helpful way, something that drives people to actually have compassion, to want to change things. So I guess in that sense, it maybe has some parallels with the extremist form of atheism. And even though I am myself an atheist, And I'm not necessarily a proponent of religion. I can see how anything can be taken to an extreme and maybe be manifesting in these different kinds of ways. And that was one thing I thought was what was very interesting about the story. Um, and and also another debate that I had in my own mind is like, well, where Philip K. Dick stands when it comes to the issue of artificial intelligence, because like many other sci-fi writers, he does indeed make AI seem like basically another version of a human being, with thoughts, with feelings, with experiences, except with maybe less emotions. Because essentially, it's taking the psychopath brain, but putting it in a machine, which is one of the only things I would say does come across as a bit campy, which raises the question for me. It's like, well, is he using it more as a metaphor for something? He's maybe using the machine as a metaphor, a reflection of something that might exist in human beings, in human nature, and warning people about it. This kind of psychopath culture that might develop. And I guess back to what I was saying earlier about education becoming more ideological than academic, you can see based on the way that his son has changed that he's not really obviously any more enlightened. He doesn't seem to be equipped to handle human relationships. You wouldn't even really feel like you trust him in an emergency. You don't think you'd be able to trust him at all. You know, when it comes to anything important, you wouldn't actually be able to trust him with anything. But he's learned how to sort of mold himself into something that is like socially acceptable, that will, basically score him a few points in maybe getting prestige, status, recognition, maybe perhaps among the elites in this world, but you don't really see specifically how he'd be that useful. There's other dimensions that normally make up what we consider a human being that don't really exist with him. And that's another thing that really haunted me about this story. So I would highly recommend it.